As probably the most popular mainstream period in the history of the wrestling industry, it's no surprise that the Attitude Era created a lot of stars. After all, this was the time when you couldn't walk through a shopping mall without seeing someone wearing a wrestling shirt. Hell, some of the performers back then were even able to fully branch out into the mainstream and become household names to a certain extent. But just who were the biggest stars of the Attitude Era? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the biggest star of them all, Stone Cold Steve Austin. Yes, never in wrestling, before or after, has there been a bigger star than Steve Austin. Come on now, if you were there at the time, then you'll remember all too well just how much of a phenomenon this guy was. No one got bigger pops whenever he came through the curtain, no one got fans more engaged, and no one sold more tickets as a result of this. Sure, there was someone else at that time who was in his orbit, someone we'll get to in a moment, and you could argue a generation prior to that, Hulk Hogan was also able to break out into the mainstream in a big way. But the reality is, for as big as anyone else is, Austin was just that little bit bigger. And the reason for this was because he so perfectly represented the ethos of the times, being the cool anti-hero looking to rebel against authority. Of course, he wasn't always supposed to be this character though. No, back during the tail end of the New Generation era, he was very much sold as being a dastardly heel. But as the culture began to change around him, the Rattlesnake suddenly found himself becoming the guy people wanted to cheer more and more. And that would all lead to him formally turning babyface at WrestleMania 13. Where would he go from there? Well, by the time WrestleMania 14 came around, he'd be fully ushering in the Attitude Era, with him largely carrying this era on his back for the next 3 years. And the reason he was carrying it was because whenever he was there, he was clearly the big star and the person most of the fans in attendance had come to see. Cody Rhodes, CM Punk, Roman Reigns, all of these people are big stars today, yet none of them can even begin to approach the level of star Stone Cold was back at the turn of the millennium. So it's only fitting today that when people think of the Attitude Era, they usually think of him first. But then there is another pillar of that time, that other big star in Austin's orbit we alluded to a moment ago. And that person is none other than our next subject, The Rock. That's right, if we're talking about wrestlers who have broken through into the mainstream, then Dwayne Johnson is easily the biggest star of them all today, as he stands as one of the biggest movie stars on the planet. Prior to his time in Hollywood though, his focus was very much on the wrestling ring, and his rise to prominence first came about during the Attitude Era. How did it start for the man then known as Rocky Maivia? Well, it would be a rocky road initially. Despite being a third-generation wrestler and having all the tools to be a superstar at his disposal, fans initially rejected the Great One, mostly on account of his pretty lame white meat babyface portrayal. But by the time the tail end of 1997 came around and the Attitude Era was about to bloom in full, he'd figured out that he could be a massive success if he just leaned into his cocky heel side. And thus, The Rock was born. A trash talker for the ages who quickly got so over, the company had to turn him babyface once more. Hell, so over would he get that by 1999 he was starting to create an argument about who was the true top dog of WWF, him or Steve Austin. And it's lucky he was in this spot then, because once the Rattlesnake had to take the majority of 2000 off in order to go and get neck surgery, the People's Champion was right there to slide into his spot as the ace of the promotion. Obviously then, once Austin came back, WWF had a unique situation where they had two generational babyfaces existing in the same place at the same time, something which has never been seen to that level before or since. But alas, this wouldn't be able to last forever, as by the time the Attitude Era had drawn to a close, The Rock was already feeling the call of Hollywood. With it being there, he would disappear to entirely come the mid-2000s. But even if his initial run was relatively short, it was undeniably impactful in a way that few others were able to create an impact. And for that reason alone, Dwayne Johnson has to be considered a pillar of the Attitude Era. But every great hero needs a villain, otherwise they wouldn't be anywhere near as effective. Luckily then, both Austin and The Rock had just this back at the turn of the millennium in the form of our next subject, Vince McMahon. Sure, he may never have been a wrestler as such, outside of those few times he did hit the ring for matches which were more angles than anything else. That said, it's undeniable that Vince McMahon was one of the key figures of the Attitude Era, and not just because he was the boss back then, the guy pulling all the strings behind the scenes. No, he was also one of the more prominent on-screen figures too, as he played the role of the evil Mr. McMahon, the guy who often stood in opposition to the top babyfaces of the day. Obviously then, a lot of the time he would be feuding with Steve Austin, Hell, the Austin vs. McMahon angle is easily the defining one of the era, and to this day, still an incredibly strong contender for greatest angle of all time. And yes, while a lot of the credit for this goes to the Rattlesnake being so catastrophically over at the time, he needed a Joker to his Batman, otherwise it would have never been even half as effective. But then, of course, there are the brief times during the Attitude Era where Vince McMahon played the babyface boss, times which aren't talked about as much, but which are just as historically important. After all, his feud with Triple H in late 1999 helped to get the game over the hump and towards that true main event level. Then there was his short spell as the man going up against The Undertaker's Ministry of Darkness earlier that year. All of this is to say that no matter what period of the Attitude Era you're talking about, Vince McMahon always had a prominent role, right up to him having one of the semi-main events at WrestleMania 17 when he fought his own son Shane. But let's move away from him for now and back to full-time wrestlers, as one of them is our next subject, a man who helped to take the late 90s to levels of hardcore violence few could have foreseen. Who are we talking about here? Why, Mick Foley, of course. Now, when you talk about the big three of the Attitude Era, pretty much everyone agrees 1 and 2 are Steve Austin and The Rock. As to that third person though, well, there are differing opinions on this, with some considering it to be The Undertaker, some considering it to be Vince McMahon himself, and some others considering it to be Mick Foley. Why Mick Foley? Well, because he overcame so much in the sense that he was a huge star who was never supposed to be a huge star. No, when Mankind first debuted with WWF during 1996, the idea was very much for him to be an upper mid-card heel in the long term. But then something happened. Fans got to know the man behind the mask, and that led to them completely falling in love with him, so much so that as time went on, they'd demand he show them different sides of himself. What were these sides? Well, anyone who was watching at the time will remember that outside of Mankind, they were Dude Love and Cactus Jack. Yes, throughout the late 90s and into the early 2000s, Mrs. Foley's baby boy would alternate between this trio of personas, with it being Mankind, who memorably gave us the absolute insane Hell in a Cell match at King of the Ring 1998, a match which in terms of sheer reckless danger and brutality may still never have been topped to this day. Of course, all of this punishment would add up for Foley over time, leading to him being forced to retire in 2000. But even then, he'd hang around for a while as an on-screen commissioner, with this giving him a whole second lease on life, as now he got to fully lean into his endearing character without having to put his body through all the same physical punishment as he had been putting it through only a few years prior. In fact, there are some who would argue that this time was a career highlight for Mick, and that's why it's still remembered so fondly today, almost as fondly as the wild stuff he was doing in 1998 and 1999. Hell, it was this role which gave him a great rivalry, albeit one which never actually hit the ring, when he so often found himself at odds with our next subject, the one, the only, Kurt Angle. That's right, there was no way we couldn't include Kurt Angle in this list, even if he didn't arrive in WWF until late 1999, a fair way into the Attitude Era. Sure, long-term, there are people who would associate him more with the Ruthless Aggression era, but it was at the turn of the millennium where he first established himself as a player in WWF. How did he do this? Well, by being an absolute phenomenon in the ring, by having some of the best matches of the era against the likes of Eddie Guerrero, and someone we'll get to in a moment. But then what would you expect from an athlete like Angle? Come on, now this was a legitimate Olympic gold medalist, with him winning the gold in amateur wrestling at the 1996 Olympic Games. Hell, so much of a prodigy did Kurt prove himself to be in the ring, he'd have won the WWF title by October of 1999, less than a year after his debut. That said, it wasn't just his technical skills which got him to this point. No, it was also his superhuman ability to pick up the entertainment side of wrestling quickly too, with his character work often being second to none. Really, even to this day, there's never been someone who picked up every aspect of wrestling quite as quickly as Kurt Angle did, and few who ever managed to do it to such a high level as he was doing at his peak. And that's exactly why, during a time when behemoths like Steve Austin and The Rock were around, he still managed to stand out from the pack and hold the top prize for a not insubstantial amount of time. Hell, so good was he that over 2 decades on, he remains in the shortlist for greatest wrestler of all time, right there amongst other performers such as Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. But not every great act of the Attitude Era was a solo one. No, back then, there were a fair few other performers who were in stables too, with their combined powers only making them even more popular. And of all the stables which came around at the turn of the millennium, arguably none were as important as Degeneration X. Now, when we talk about Degeneration X, we're really talking about two very different eras of the group. Well, actually, there are far more than that if we include their entire history, but if we're sticking to the Attitude Era alone, then there's the original incarnation, which existed in late 1997 and early 1998, and then the second incarnation, which came after that. And when it comes to the first, that was formed when Shawn Michaels and Triple H, two best friends behind the scenes and key members of the Clique, decided to create an on-screen partnership, one which pretty soon came to include Chyna and Rick Rude too. But for as much as this group got over as a heel act during the days of the Proto-Attitude Era, arguably even more success was found for DX once Shawn Michaels had to enter temporary retirement as a result of a back injury in the spring of 1998. And the reason the group found arguably even more success here was because this was when, rather than fall apart at the seams as so many other stables would have done, the heels rebuilt themselves from the ground up as a babyface group. Yes, while Triple H and Chyna would both still be members of Degeneration X 2.0, HBK and Rude wouldn't be. No, instead they'd be replaced by X-Pac and the New Age Outlaws. Needless to say then, it didn't take long for this version of the group to get massively over with kids as a lovable group of rascals, and that would see them all the way through to the spring of 1999. Unfortunately though, at that point, they would find themselves going their own separate ways, though not forever because before the Attitude Era ended, DX 2.0 would come back again, though this time as a heel act when they were basically the lackeys for Triple H and Stephanie McMahon during the days of the McMahon-Helmsley regime. Yes, whatever part of the turn of the millennium period you're looking at, Degeneration X had a key role to play, and that's exactly why they're still so fondly remembered today, whether we're talking about the Shawn Michaels-led version or the Triple H-led one. But what about another great stable of the time period, one which was made up of a trio of oddities who didn't exactly go together on the face of things? That's right, it's time for us to talk about Too Cool. Too Cool, perhaps never before has a comedy undercard act reached such heights. And make no mistake about it, this was very much what the duo of Scotty 2 Hotty and Grandmaster Sexay were meant to be when they first began teaming up together in early 1998, back when they were going by the name of Too Much. But then something happened which turned their fortunes around in late 1999 when they added a third member to their unit when an unlikely ally in Rikishi joined forces with them. That's right, the father of Jimmy, Jay, and Solo Sikoa. Back in early 1999, Rikishi was struggling to find himself as, after a few dodgy gimmicks over the years, he was still looking for a way to fully establish who he was with the WWF audience. Who would have thought then that the key to solving all of his problems was to team up with a pair of comedy goofballs and become WWF's resident dancing big man? And while the dreaded dancing gimmick is so often the end for any performer looking to be taken seriously, in this case, it somehow worked. So well did it work in fact, by the time mid-2000 came around, Rikishi would be one of the top babyfaces on the roster. And this meant that, as they were usually by his side, Scotty 2 Hotty and Grandmaster Sexay became massive babyfaces themselves. Sure, once WWF made the decision to turn Rikishi heel in late 2000 after he was revealed to be the man who'd run over Steve Austin the year before, things started to go off the rails. But none of this will ever be able to take away from the fact that, while they were at their peak, Too Cool were mega over as babyfaces, right up there with some of the biggest stars of the era. But they weren't the only people not named Steve Austin or The Rock who were mega over during the heights of the Attitude Era. No, there were other people who were approaching this level too, and not all men either. No, you could make a solid argument that our next subject was quietly one of the biggest stars of the time, the one, the only, Sable. Yes, just go back and listen to some of the pops she got whenever she came out through the curtain in 1998. Honestly, those are Steve Austin level pops, right? Yes, it's true that if you look back on her career, there wasn't a lot in the way of great matches, but Rena Mero's charisma was so high that this didn't really matter. No, all that mattered was that whenever she was put on screen, fans adored her. And that's not to say that Sable never did anything worthwhile in the ring, as she did have that memorable series against Luna Vachon, and at one point even got to powerbomb her then husband Mark Mero right out of the Island of Relevance. Ultimately though, Sable's initial run in WWF would be a short run, as by the time the summer of 1999 came around, she'd be gone, with this being the last time we'd see her on screen until she returned for a short period during the Ruthless Aggression era. But even if she wasn't around for the full Attitude Era, she was able to leave a hell of a mark when she was there. And the exact same thing could be said about our next subject, another woman who rose to prominence during this time, the ninth wonder of the world, Chyna. Of course, one look at Chyna back then would have told you she was always destined to be a megastar. After all, how could anyone who had the imposing physique she had not stand out from the crowd? And it wasn't just her physique which made her stand out. No, it was also her ability to connect with crowds in a way that few other women could during the Attitude Era. Yes, much of her early success came about as a result of her affiliation with Degeneration X, a group we've already looked at today, but that's far from the only win Joanie Laurer had during the turn of the millennium period. No, even after she left DX behind in early 1999, she'd continue to go from success to success, this time as a solo act. Hell, so big of a name would she become at this point, it wouldn't be uncommon for her to mix it up with the men. This was how we saw her enter the 1999 Royal Rumble, and it was also how we saw her at one point be considered as the opponent for Stone Cold Steve Austin at SummerSlam later that year. But while she might never have gotten that main event with Austin, Chyna got a hell of a consolation prize, as not long after that, she'd make history by becoming the first, and to date, only woman in WWE to hold the Intercontinental title. Honestly, there's so much about women's wrestling which we probably wouldn't have today if it weren't for Chyna. Really, much of what we see on Raw in 2025 with Rhea Ripley is heavily based on her. And before that, the Beth Phoenixes of the world owed a lot to the ninth wonder of the world. But let's move away from the women for a moment and back to the men instead, as it's there we find our next subject. Not just any man, but a dead man. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but one of the key figures of the Attitude Era, in anyone's estimation, The Undertaker. Yes, the dead man was one of the few people who could be put on the same pedestal as Steve Austin and The Rock. But then even before the Attitude Era, The Undertaker was already one of WWF's top stars. Hell, he'd first made a splash in the company during the tail end of the Golden Era in 1990. So when the late 90s came around, Mark Calaway was more than ready to help push the WWF to even greater heights, with him at this point already serving the role as elder statesman of sorts, a wild thing to consider given the fact he was still wrestling as recently as 2020. And the way he played this elder statesman at the turn of the millennium was by feuding with all the top guys and helping to get them over, whether he was a babyface or a heel at the time. That's right, Stone Cold, The Rock, Kurt Angle, Triple H, Mick Foley, they all found themselves coming face to face with the dead man at some point. And some of them even got to come face to face with the biker too, as it was in 2000, just as the second half of the Attitude Era was kicking into full swing, that Mark Calaway took a massive risk by completely reinventing his character. But this was a risk which paid off big time in the end, as it allowed him to flourish all over again with something that was much closer to his real-life personality, a hard Texan who loved a good fight more than anything else. That said, whether he was playing the role of the Lord of Darkness or that of the American Badass, there was always one person who remained closely interlinked with the former 7-time world champion during this period. And the reason for that was because, in kayfabe at least, they were his brother. Yes, the time has come for us to talk about our next subject, one of the key figures of the Attitude Era, the Big Red Machine, Kane. Yes, while Stone Cold and The Rock were undoubtedly the two most popular wrestlers of the era, many fans found themselves drawn to other characters like Kane. Why was this? Well, despite first being introduced in late 1997 as a Michael Myers-esque horror movie villain, Kane eventually turned into one of the most unlikely babyfaces of the era. Sure, before he got there, he'd wage a war on just about every babyface on the roster, with his feud with The Undertaker probably being his high point during this run. But come late 1998, something strange was starting to happen. People were starting to fall in love with the villain, and this led to him completely upending his character and finding a total second wind with it as the lovable babyface who, for a while at least, found himself teaming up with X-Pac. And even once that team came to an end, Kane would remain a good guy, purely for the reason that by then, any outcast watching the show had started to see something of a kindred spirit in the wounded animal that his character represented. Still though, for as much as it was his babyface incarnation which got him the most fan support, it's arguably still that initial heel run which represents his best work, as perhaps never before or since in the history of WWE has the unstoppable heel monster gimmick been quite as effective. Hell, so effective was he that he even got to dethrone Steve Austin and become WWF champion in the middle of 1998, right at the Rattlesnake's peak of popularity, even if it was only for one day. Yes, when it comes down to it, few wrestlers personified the madness and fun that was the Attitude Era better than Kane. And that's why he's still so fondly remembered by so many fans to this day, with people like Tegan Knox still listing him as their favorite wrestler. But what about another Attitude Era star we've yet to talk about, one who joined WWF in 1999 and is still active as a performer to this day? Well, that would be our next subject, a man we alluded to earlier on in this video, Y2J himself, Chris Jericho. That's right, well, he might have first risen to prominence in WCW during their boom period while the NWO was running roughshod over the entire industry. It wasn't until he jumped over to WWF in the summer of 1999 that Chris Jericho went to another level of success altogether. And that was because, after a rocky few months where many weren't sure if he was going to make it or not, by the time 2000 came around, he was in full swing as one of the top guys in the company's upper mid-card. Yes, all you had to do back then was put the Ayatollah of rock and rolla in the ring with someone like a Kurt Angle or an Eddie Guerrero, and you knew you were going to get a great match that night. Sure, many of his greatest career achievements would come later down the line, achievements like his excellent heel run during the tail end of the Ruthless Aggression era, or his role in helping to get All Elite Wrestling off the ground in 2019. But for those who were a fan of him back in the day, it's probably still his turn of the millennium period that he'll be remembered for most fondly. And that's because this was the time where he first truly established himself as a star and a guy who could operate at the highest level both in the ring and on the mic. Seriously, so over was this guy in 2000, he'd even at one point get a Phantom World title win over Triple H, with this creating a moment where the crowd absolutely lost their minds with joy, all before it was overturned later that same night, of course. But even if he didn't get to keep the belt, the whole moment helped to prove to his bosses that, even if he was smaller than the average main eventer of the time, Chris Jericho was still lapping most of those people, as he was a level of talent few could ever dream of being. Hell, that's probably why in late 2001, right at the point in time between the Attitude Era and the Ruthless Aggression Era, he'd be trusted with getting a run with the top prize when he became the first ever undisputed champion. But then what else would you expect from a man who, like everyone else we've looked at today, was so key to the success of the most successful period the wrestling industry has ever seen to date?